Hello, everybody. Welcome. I hope you can hear me and see me. My name is Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. Yes, there's a bunch of you. I have you on tile view now. So welcome to the third Sensemaker Live Think-In, coming to you from South London and North London, and I hope from Denmark and Berlin, and maybe even Nova Scotia. And of course, lots of you from the UK. We're doing this in partnership with Santander, as we have, as I say, in previous weeks. They're our founding partner, and we are really grateful to them for supporting us as the whole news business is forced yet again to reinvent itself and at the same time report on, frankly, the biggest story that most of us, maybe some honorable exceptions in this company, have ever encountered. First, briefly, for those of you who are new to Think-Ins, it is the cornerstone of tortoise-style slow journalism, where we try to do two things at once: slow it down and open it up by listening to each other. And the Sensemaker is where we compensate for that. And every day, I and other Tortoise editors and colleagues, including Barney, who's with us on the chat today. Hi, Barney. Try to make sense of the more conventional news, the breaking news, and make sure that Tortoise members don't miss out on it. And we try to sift it continually for what we think really matters, what's driving it, and what is important about it. And Sensemaker Live, of course, is where it all comes together, Friday lunchtime. And I think the tagline that we have for the text Sensemaker is quite a good one to remember now. What just happened? And we're all stuck at home, and the business of news gathering, I think, is changing for all of us. For some of us, the family suddenly get involved, and one member of my family, who shall remain nameless, rushed into this room where I am now earlier today with a fantastic story, so she thought, of giant crabs being released all over an airport baggage reclaim. Has anyone seen that? I'm not even sure if it's news, but these are the kinds of stories that are getting thrust upon us all, even as we try to do more conventional news gathering. But what has just happened this week? Right off the top of my head, Donald Trump has blinked in his showdown with US state governors over who gets to decide when they reopen for business. And that's probably a good thing, because unfortunately today they reported the highest death toll from coronavirus since the outbreak began. It more than doubled in a single day to 4,000 in one day. The Chinese economy is shrinking, and I hope we'll talk about that a bit more and what it means for the rest of us. In the UK, our shutdown is going to continue for at least another 3 weeks. And one story that I drew attention to in our written Sensemaker this morning was what I think is a really interesting interview that Macron has given to the FT. As a journalist, I confess to being really impressed and envious by the fluent French spoken by the new editor of the FT and her Paris bureau chief. Very impressive, but also it's really interesting to listen to Macron in full flow. Rather, as I said about Obama earlier in the week, you don't have to be a fan of his to be forcibly struck by his fluency, his enthusiasm for ideas, and the energy that he's bringing to the whole business of rethinking the world in this very acute emergency, and in particular, rethinking Europe's role in it. His prognosis for Europe, if it fails to react, is really very, very serious. He says the Eurozone is in peril, and the very European idea. The nuts and bolts that he refers to there, and I do urge you to get a look at it. If you've got a subscription to the FT, they may even put it up there for free, is that he wants Germany and the Netherlands to get behind a really vastly bigger debt support package than they have hitherto. So that's looking backwards a little bit. And as we go forward, we have an hour. Please, either by raising your hand, actually, we should do this housekeeping, shouldn't we? We have an hour. And just show me, everybody, that you know how to raise your hand electronically. Go to the participants button at the bottom of your screen. And there we go. You're all brilliant at it. Excellent, excellent, excellent. And lower them again. And why don't you raise them again if you think, because I want to look forward now, and as you're thinking about things that you may want to raise, I'd like to talk about the future of travel, what we think and hope public transport and airports and air travel might look like going forward, the future of schools. It's just been brought to my attention here in the UK that exam results, which are going to be faked anyway, are going to be delivered later than we thought. How does that affect you or your families? But before we get to that, as I mentioned, we've got some people dialing in from around the world. And raise your hand again if you think Denmark has jumped the gun a little bit by already opening its primary schools. Let's see if there are any blue hands there. A few, but not many. There seems to be considerable respect for Denmark's judgment on this. Now, Sina Tholstrup, am I pronouncing your first name right? Can we, Sina, if you put up your hand and everybody else lower yours, then Barney can get to you. Hold on, we can't hear you yet. Hold on, Sina, I can't hear you yet. Can we unmute Sina? If you'd raise, if you can raise your hand electronically. Barney, Sina's window has ST on it. There we go.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Perfect.
How do I raise my hand electronically?
If you click on the list of participants, which appears at the in the black line at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah.
And then underneath the list on the right-hand side, there's a raise hand button. But we've got you now.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us. You run a fashion brand in Denmark. You also have a 10-year-old son who you say has just gone back to school.
Yes, it's his first day in school today.
Right.
They have left in the
UK,
the smaller.
as you know, with everyone's still barred from going back to school. Do you have confidence in that decision, or does part of you think it might be premature?
No, I think it's a good idea. I think maybe we reacted pretty promptly in Denmark, and I think it's been working well. But I don't know if maybe we have. It's easy to be clever when you look on the backside, but maybe we have definitely not. Maybe we have overreacted a little bit, or at least the things we feared for, like the overload of the health system, has not taken place, luckily. So I think it's a good time to kind of loosen up. Right.
I'm looking this morning at Worldometers, one of the databases. There have been so far 321 deaths related to coronavirus, and a little over 7,000 infections. Now, 321 deaths is a lot of deaths. If this was in a football stadium, it would be a disaster of historic proportions. But that compares with tens of thousands in the US and between 10 and 20,000 in many European countries. We are living with a sense of catastrophe. Is it very different in Denmark? Does it feel like a catastrophe or something else?
I think it's more the rhetoric around it. That's it kinds of there's this panicking sense of there's but we don't live like that. I think people are calm and not panicking as such, and that's also why I think it's about time that we open up the society.
Right. And just before we move on to Germany, just a couple more questions. How extensive was the lockdown in Berlin? I mean, shops and did they remain open, and were you allowed to go out and move around? And just for comparison, we if we obey the rules here, are only allowed out for half an hour a day.
Do you ask me in Denmark?
Yes.
Yes, we are allowed to move around. Mid-March, certain shops were closed, hairdressers were closed, physiotherapists, etc., were closed. Everything like that was closed. Department stores, everything. But we are allowed to move around as long as we keep a distance of at least 2 meters. And then we are not allowed to assemble more than 10 persons at a time. And it's still like that. And they continue to have this limitation until at least mid-August.
Mm. And you were saying that as a business, the clothing line that you run, because you sell it to retailers, you won't know until later in the year the full economic impact. In other words, the impact on consumers' wallets that this has had. What's your sense of how serious it's going to be?
I think it's pretty serious for the classical retail business. It's really serious, and I think a lot of our customers, the small boutiques, will end up closing. But we won't see the impact, or we won't feel the impact until July, August, when we are going to deliver the next collection.
Right.
So we have an online store ourselves, and most of our customers are onliners, and they actually do okay, and we do fine too on our online. But the small boutiques, there will be a big impact on those.
Right.
And thereby on us.
You're clearly aware of the massively higher infection rates and death tolls in many of your neighbours. Here, for example, is there an anxiety that as Denmark tries to go back to normal, borders will open and the virus will return or arrive on a scale that it has not until now?
Yes, there is an anxiety. I feel it myself, and also in the society that I mean we've been pretty disciplined to begin with. I mean, we've kept the distance. We accepted the shutdowns of shops. We closed the borders, which was pretty extreme. And we kind of accepted this, and we've been very disciplined, and that's probably also why it's been working.
Right.
I could fear that we will loosen up, not as a society as such, but individuals will loosen up too quick because they don't understand the consequences.
But you're pretty confident that should infection rates go up again, then this discipline will kick in again?
I don't know if you can turn back, roll back. I don't know. We've never tried it before, but hopefully we can.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I mean, from where I'm sitting, it seems as if you've dodged a bullet. I hope it remains like that. I'm going to move on to Berlin, and I know, Sina, that you have to go at past. So stick around just for a few minutes if you can, but thanks very much for joining us. Is Amy with us from Berlin? Amy Newis. Yes, and she's even raised her hand. That's terrific. Amy, hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for joining us. for the last few weeks, all of us trying to report this story in the UK have been looking enviously at Germany as a comparable sized country that just got its act together quicker. Should we be envious? How does it feel? Do you feel enviable?
I think the first thing to know about Germans, I'm not German, I'm British, but I live in Berlin, is that Germans are very obedient when it comes to rules. And so I think our lockdown started a week before it did in the UK. And people just straight away did what they were told. So I think that helps a lot. You don't have rule breakers. But it doesn't feel here like we're having an easy time. We've still had a lot of things shut down. We can still go to the park. The playgrounds were open. I've got twin 2-year-olds. So the playgrounds were still open for a while, but then they got shut down. So that's been quite difficult. But we can still go to the supermarket. The flower shops are open. We go for ice cream every other day. And all of the cafes have changed to takeaway places. So you can go to where you would normally go and just take away. Bike shops are open. Garden centres are open. And from May the 4th, hairdressers are going to be open again. So on the one hand, it's not been too difficult. You can't go and buy clothes, but of course you can buy them online. The public transport's running a bit slower, but basically people are keeping to themselves, so that's okay. Most people are working from home. The government has really supported self-employed people.
In what way? I mean, with checks in the bank?
Yeah, my husband is self-employed and he just had to fill out 1 page of information to do with his tax. So he didn't have to upload a tax return, just actually put his tax number and his bank details and a few other things. And we got €5,000. Is
that a grant or an interest-free loan? Or
that's, we're just gonna get that money unless it's not totally clear how they're gonna check it later, but I think they're gonna look at people's tax returns and see if they normally would have earned that money. I think it's meant to last you 3 or 4 months. So if he can prove that he normally would have earned that, then he will keep it. That's it. Yeah.
I gather that Merkel has recently announced that most schools, as things stand, will reopen in May, but you have heard that the kindergartens will not reopen until August. How did that strike you?
Awful. So I am actually a teacher, but I'm not working at the moment. So I also know a little bit about what's going on at schools, and they're actually only opening the older years, so the exam years. It's not all classes. And there are limits on how many children that can be there, but they will be opening those step by step. But so we were meant to open everything again provisionally 19th of April. And then yesterday they announced, they would be closing all daycare centres until the 1st of August, which in this country is free. Mm-hmm. We pay €23 a month and the children go full time, and that's from age 1. Most children go full time. It's a hangover from the DDR that it's free. And you're expected, it's part of a community, it's kind of like school. So normally my children would be having breakfast there, 8:30, and I'd pick them up 3 o'clock, 3:30, Monday to Friday. So that's gone. That's gone for not just for a few more weeks, but a few more months.
But this is a hangover from the DDR, that's old East Germany, that now applies across Germany?
Yeah, so, or at least, well, the way that Germany is structured is a little bit different. It's more like the US. So even though Merkel said that she wants all of these things to happen, it's up to the individual states to decide how they implement them. So actually the east of Germany was a lot more affected by coronavirus initially, and then Berlin. So I can imagine there'll be certain states that will open things up sooner, but as it stands in Berlin at least, and Brandenburg, which is kind of a ring around Berlin, yeah, we're going to try and do the same thing apparently. And yeah, it's months. There's a chance that one of my children who has special needs, which are quite mild relatively, I suppose, that we can deal with it, it's fine, but if there's a chance that he will be able to go back a little bit, but he also has lung issues. And the thought really of sending him back when I'm not working doesn't really feel right, because obviously I don't want him to get sick. So if there is that risk. Having said that, having twin 2-year-olds at home all day is quite stressful. So maybe we will send them back if we can for a couple of days. I don't know, because of course we have no support. Even if we lived next door to my parents who live in England, they wouldn't be able to help us. So,
well, they seem to be being very well behaved right now.
They're out.
Okay, taking them for a walk. Tina, you've patiently had your hand up. Was there something that you wanted to pitch in on that's related to elsewhere in Europe? Can we go to Tina?
No, I was just thinking about Berlin and Germany, because I am German, but I live in London, so it's the opposite. And I think what we must not forget is that they started testing really early, and also they were very prepared for a pandemic. There was this famous, I think, report out in the UK in 2016 where they sort of tested for pandemic, wasn't it? I might get my dates wrong, but they did a sort of, like they do with terrorism, you know, they sort of test what the country would be like, and it failed, and it was recommended that we do something about it. And of course the UK didn't, but Germany was much more prepared. They have a very good health system. And also, I would probably disagree that everybody's obedient. I know lots of Germans are really not happy with a lot of the stuff, but yes, I would say as a nation, you know, maybe that is so. I think the English are quite obedient, actually. They're more passive, but, you know, another story. So I think we must not forget about the testing. So I don't think it's just because they locked down 1 week earlier. I think there's more things to that. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much. There's an interesting, if personal, question on the chat, Amy, which you have absolutely no obligation to answer, but Karen is interested to know whether you've been tested, because this is one of the things that, well, Tina brought up, and many people do, this idea of mass testing.
Actually, the experience here has been a little bit different from what the woman was just saying there. I had a friend who is a teacher who almost definitely had coronavirus. She returned back from a school trip, so she'd been with 80 children, I think, and she had symptoms, and it was right at the beginning of it being in Berlin. And she was obviously really worried because she'd been with all these kids and they'd all gone home to their families. And she really, really, really struggled to not just get tested, but also get a sick note. They wouldn't test her. Nobody would test her. The doctors here, even though we do have a really good healthcare system, switched their phones off because too many people were calling. And she didn't get tested. She still doesn't know if she had it. And actually, we had an appointment for our children at the Kinderarzt, the children's doctor, that was planned, and we were discussing the risks with him, with our son who's got lung issues, and he said, we absolutely, at that stage, this is several weeks ago, are not testing most people because we don't have enough tests. That's at the beginning of all of this. He gave an example. So he's a heart specialist, as it happens, that's his specialism. So he said, I have a family and they definitely have it. It's clear, but there's no reason to test them because they're okay. So the 5 of them are just isolating. I've told them not to come in. However, I have a child who has a fever, but no other symptoms, and he's going in for heart surgery next week. And we need to prove that he doesn't have it so he can have his surgery. So he will get a test. And that was a 1-year-old. And he said, sure, they've said there's 10,000 people in Berlin with coronavirus. there's obviously going to be 100,000 when they say 10,000. That was right at the beginning. So it's been a big shift in the last few weeks that they're testing now. But at the beginning, there was a lot of bitterness. I saw stuff on social media as well, people going to hospitals and queuing for 3 hours and being put in a sort of makeshift tent marquee with loads of other people who were waiting for testing for hours, and then being refused tests because they weren't in a risk category, and then saying, well, we've probably got it now. So it's not on the ground here. It's not actually been this wonderful system.
That's fascinating. It's a much less organized picture than we're given to believe in many reports. Do you think, but you say that it has changed since the beginning. And do you think that Berlin is different from the rest of Germany in this respect?
Berlin is a very poor capital city with a lot of corruption. When I say that, I don't mean, I guess it's just, yeah, it's complex. There's a complex history in Berlin because it was split in half. So even though that was decades ago now, it's still, there are hangovers from that in the medical system, in all the formal systems, there are hangovers to that. Yeah, I was discussing with my friend who was stuck at home really ill, and she's single on her own, ringing the hotline that just didn't even ring. There is something similar to NHS Direct, she called that, and that worked, but basically was useless as well. She was saying, do you think this is that the system is overloaded, or that there's actually been a decision made that they just don't test people unless they show up in A&E? But even then, as I say, in the big hospitals, people were taken there. I mean, actually, the first case of coronavirus in this city was sent home because he thought he had meningitis. They said, you don't have meningitis, just go home. And then 2 days later, the test came back positive and he was brought back to hospital. So yeah, it's like everything with this, it's very complex. It doesn't feel so perfect as it's implied in the UK. Very
interesting. Thank you, Amy. I want to ask everybody, but Amy too, and Sina, if you're still with us, about trust in government, because this is another theme that's been playing strongly in the UK and in the great sort of bipolar tussle between Washington and Beijing. Again, the impression that we have is that even though execution of policies may not have been perfect, Merkel retains, by and large, the trust of most Germans in a way that the convalescing government in the UK just doesn't. It's had a week of press conferences in which press and ministers and experts have been at loggerheads over promises not kept, targets that seem to be unattainable. Are we right in thinking that trust in government has held up a bit better in Germany, do you think?
I think so. I mean, Merkel's in a tricky time. She's coming to the end of her premiership, and that's a bit of a mess right now. But she's been Chancellor for over 10 years, and she's a Christian Democrat, so I don't believe in all of her policies. However, she's a really steady hand. She's so level-headed, and she was a scientist before she went into politics. So this is really, I think, yeah, she's the right person for this situation, absolutely, because she doesn't react. She's not inflammatory. She's very level-headed. I don't know if you saw, there was a photo even of her just before she had to go in self-quarantine because a doctor had treated her just for something else and he turned out to have coronavirus. And there was a photo of her in one of the low rent supermarkets, kind of like Lidl, with her shopping basket with toilet roll and 3 bottles of wine in there just before she went into self-quarantine. And she knew she was having her photo taken from the queue and she was smiling. And of course, that just makes her really, that does make her likable, that, you know, the Germans know that she's human after all, but she's taking it seriously. And yeah, she's the opposite of Trump, isn't she? Complete opposite.
But was that not a carefully staged photo op? I mean, if you're a head of state,
so.
You don't think so?
I've seen her in the street. I mean, yeah.
What about her security?
Yeah, I think she was getting in the car. She was coming out of her apartment and getting in her car, but she goes to the theatre, she goes to concerts. she goes to restaurants. I know people that have seen her coming out of restaurants. I don't know.
Blimey. Well, thank you. That's really interesting. Can I, unless anybody wants to pitch in at this point on the question of trust in government, including the UK government, maybe Matt Hancock is doing his best and has been given a hard time by the media. If you think so, do raise your hand. If you think the government deserves everything thrown at it by Piers Morgan and others, say so too. But I hope that Isabel Hilton is just before we come to you, Isabel, my colleague James has raised his hand.
Hey Charles, I was just really struck by something. I see Isabel's going to speak, so I'm going to be very quick. I was just really struck by the thing that you wrote in the Sensemaker in the email today about Macron and then van der Leyen's effectively apology to Italy. And do you remember we had a conversation after we'd done that thinking that we did in Greece, in Lesbos, and it was a conversation about the way the Italians felt they'd been let down by Europe over migration. And it just struck me, given what Macron said in the FT today, what van der Leyen is saying, that there is potentially something really significant going on here, and that Italy will be the place, rather than France, but Italy might well be the place where you see this greater frustration at Europe. And, you know, it's really interesting to hear the points of view from Denmark, from Germany, but there is something maybe that comes out of this that we don't expect around the EU. That's, I'm not helping making sense, but I'm certainly finding myself scratching my head about that.
Well, I mean, certainly Macron lives in fear, as he says quite explicitly, of populists all over Europe and including in France. But I'm sure you're right that the way the balances are currently sitting, the risk is greatest in Italy, with 22,000 people dead. The contrast between that peninsula at one end of Europe and the Danish one at the other could not be more stark, could it? Isabel, thanks for raising your hand. I wanted to ask, it'd be great if we could get on to the question of whom we should believe as Washington under this present administration tells us that we should believe nothing coming out of Beijing, and that the WHO is in cahoots with Beijing. But first, I wanted to refer to something. Oh, you've got a wonderful background.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's a Tibetan marmot having an unfortunate encounter with a Tibetan wolf.
Oh my goodness, he reminds me of, am I allowed to say this? He reminds me of Lewis in Suits. Anyway. The Chinese economy is contracting sharply for the first time probably since the 70s.
Yeah.
And I've read that the Politburo, the Communist Party, operates on the assumption that sort of retain its social contract, it needs at least 6% growth a year, and it needs to be creating 10 million urban jobs a year. And I'm no expert, but if it's even if the economy bounces back in the second half of this year, it's not going to be able to do either of those things. And I just wonder if Xi Jinping is operating on tight margins like that, then what's the upshot? What's the big political upshot?
It's a good question, and I am always slightly wary of predictions in China, but certainly you're right that since 1989, since Tiananmen, the deal has been, party says to people, stay out of politics and we will make you richer. Now that was fine until they began to approach the end of the catch-up industrial cycle, which happened maybe 5 years ago. And it became evident that the economy would slow just because, you know, that's where they were in that cycle. The problem is, you know, all that works, as it did with other Asian tigers. And then you gradually price yourself out of all your market advantages. So your cheap labor isn't so cheap anymore. It gets a little scarce. And all kinds of things begin to affect the pattern of growth. The Chinese anticipated this, and they were very concerned about how to make that transition, how to get through the middle income trap. Began warning everyone that it was going to slow down, set a target of 6% GDP. One thing to remember about Chinese GDP figures is that they're aspirational. They're not telling you what happened. They're telling you what the party wants to happen. So it becomes very difficult for officials to report under that target, because then they've failed. So, you know, this is one of many reasons why Chinese figures are highly problematic, including the figures here. Unemployment is going to be a big factor. It would have been anyway. There are shortages of labor in certain sectors, but there is also quite a large lump of labor which doesn't have the skills to make it to the higher value, higher technology economy. They're the migrant workers, they're the people who actually built the buildings and the infrastructure over the last many years. But as that section of the economy begins to kind of fade out, they are a problem, and they will have been people who've been particularly hit in the crash, the first quarter crash that is virus attributed. At the moment, the economy is running at about 80%. That's not enough. We don't really know how far down it's been. And the other problem is that, you know, China depends very much on global markets, despite the efforts to pivot to internal consumption. And those markets are going to be very badly hit. And I think the third thing I would watch out for is debt along the Belt and Road. So the great infrastructure project involving more than 100 countries, financed by China, but financed through loans to countries which will no longer be able to afford to repay those loans as predicted. So lots of troubles, you know, in the very near future for the Chinese economy. What you see as a political response to that, it's a very, very, I mean, this was an authoritarian regime even before this. And so, you know, you've got a ramping up of both nationalistic messages and didn't we do well messages, and look what a mess democracies are making of this situation messages, and all of that. You're lucky to live in China. You're lucky we're looking after you. Pay no attention to those decadent Western systems, and just hang on. It's going to be difficult, but the party is looking after you. And that's going to be how they seek to manage it, with very strict controls on what's allowed to be said, strict controls on social media, very tight controls and on all the propaganda instruments. And they're going to hope to get through it that way. But it's going to be difficult.
Right. And just coming back to the first of the unemployment point, this is clearly one of the reasons that they're so anxious, apart from macroeconomic reasons, so anxious to get big employment centers like Wuhan itself open again. Is there any way of judging from this distance the risk that they're running in doing so? You know, the signs are that, you know, absent a vaccine, this virus just comes back and hits you again. If it does, do you think the Beijing reflex will be just locked down all over again and suck up the cost, or will they have to be more imaginative?
I guess it will. I mean, I don't think it'll be a blanket shutdown as it has been. I think that over the past 2-3 months, they've developed quite a few quite precise tools, you know, kind of tracking people's movements on mobile phones, being able to track what sort of contact people have had, being able to selectively close down. You know, people are already hurting. There hasn't been a massive economic support for people who've lost wages. And, you know, there is a large sector of the economy in the sort of small and medium enterprises, which is pretty important. And they are really, really suffering. And so far, we haven't seen from the Chinese government any kind of huge economic stimulus, the way or the kind of levels of support that you've seen in some Western democracies. So people are hurting. So I think if they do find there's a recurrence, then I think the lockdown will be pretty selective. At the moment, they're reporting 2 continuing minor hotspots, but nevertheless recurring cases. One is in Guangdong, which is in the southeast of China near Hong Kong, and the other is in Heilongjiang, which is just on the Russian border. And they, as the Chinese report these cases, most of them are people who've come from outside China.
Right.
Still one or two local cases. Now, if you can believe those figures, and of course, back to the caveat about figures, things have stabilized pretty well.
Okay. One of the things that we try to do on Sensemaker Live, whose initials do resemble those of Saturday Night Live, but we're slightly more serious, is to talk about the reporting of the story as well as the story itself. And Shireen on chat has noted that China's recently kicked out US reporters from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, so you won't be getting as much critical reporting from there. Is that right? The people working there very well and have done yourself. Do you feel we're losing a critical mass of critical reporting?
Well, the reporters who've been kicked out are excellent reporters and with a long experience in China. Yeah, it's tricky. This is, again, it was a tit-for-tat battle. This begins with a headline on an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, which annoyed the Chinese, and they kicked out 2 Wall Street Journal reporters. Again, excellent reporters who had nothing to do with either the opinion piece or the headline. Donald Trump broke with a long-standing American tradition of not doing tit-for-tat responses, because who knows? Anyway, he decided on effectively a tit-for-tat response, which was to set a limit on the number of staff that could be employed by Chinese state media in the United States. And that meant about 40 people had to leave the United States. In return for that, well, that gave China an excuse to boot out journalists from the 3 prime newspapers, so the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and New York Times. And they are, very good reporters. There are still reporters in China, AP, all the agencies have their reporters, all the European press still have their reporters. The Brits haven't been hit. But certainly, yes, it's a loss. They weren't kicked out for what they were doing. They were kicked out as part of this insane kind of, propaganda war between Donald Trump and the People's Republic.
That's fascinating. I want to change the subject a little bit because Jason is saying in the chat, Jason, maybe you'd like to, how do you feel if we turned the camera and the mic on you? You're suggesting that there's a great opportunity now for cash-rich countries. Jason.
Well, yeah, hopefully you can hear me. As a avid football fan, but not of Newcastle United, I've noticed that the Saudi Arabians have swooped down on Newcastle United, although that might not be considered a trophy asset. There's lots of companies at the moment who are short of cash, and their valuations may have dropped substantially. If you're sitting on a lot of cash, and the Chinese are, Saudis are, Qataris are, UAE is, then this is a great opportunity to come in and pick up these assets and also present yourself as a savior rather than an asset stripper. So I'm just saying that I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see quite a lot of those sort of deals coming across. Right.
So it could be an extension of face mask diplomacy. It's certainly on China's part.
Well, that certainly happened after the financial crash, and there were a lot of distress assets to pick up. China was extremely cash rich at that point. Yeah. I'd say a couple of things about it. China's less cash rich, and there's been a big effort actually to restrict outbound investment over the past couple of years, and a lot of deals have come, were quite advanced state. Were called off because the funds couldn't be got out of China. But you will see some selective approaches, and they will be looking for, as they have been, advanced technology, the kind of bright startups or the kind of anything in technology. How far that will go will depend on particularly in Europe, on how seriously the Europeans take their rather recent reservations about allowing Chinese investment, and that as I'm sure you know, began with Germany with the purchase of a German technology company, which rather alarmed people, in the sense that China was becoming a technology power and was simply hoovering up everybody else's assets. So there has been a move to screen and possibly restrict incoming investment in Europe. Whether Britain will take a similar approach, I couldn't begin to guess. Maybe we should offer them more football teams.
Well, just to say, that's where the Chinese have actually stopped people buying. That they were very worried about them spending a lot of money on football, footballers and football teams. But the interesting question will come in natural resources, because there's a lot of mining companies who've got a lot of trouble at the moment, because they're either having to close down mines or put mines on restricted output because of COVID-19, and they are really strapped for cash. So maybe not the big ones, not the Rio Tintos, but some of the ranking ones.
Yeah, well, I think I would look again. I'd probably look in Africa, in Latin America, and maybe in Australia for signs of that. There is another element here, though. I think it's going to be complicated for China, and I mentioned before the Belt and Road loans. Part of the kind of anti-China propaganda has raised the question of debt trap diplomacy. Chinese lending was certainly pretty unconstrained for quite a long time. And China wants these projects to go ahead. It wants to be able to export its infrastructure capabilities. It wants to be able to, absorb some of its excess capacity in steel and cement and all that kind of thing. And so there was some pretty loose lending for projects which were meant to create value, not all of which did create value, and which the host countries had some trouble paying back. Now, imagine in 6 months' time what those host countries are going to be looking at. They're going to be much poorer, much more strapped for anything. And that's Chinese money that is, sitting in unperforming loans. I think China is going to be reasonably selective. It's not going to be throwing its money around the way it did 10 years ago, because it just doesn't have the same quantity of cash. And there have been some pretty negative experiences, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, a number of countries in which China kind of showcased its, we're fine, we're the best partner to have because we don't impose any nasty conditions the way the IMF does or the way Western lenders do. We just give you the money. That's not a very sound policy when the tide starts to go out, or even before the tide starts to go out.
Isabel, thank you. There's some interesting stuff going on in the chat that I want to come to before we run out of time. But while we have you, can we just come back to the question of whether you believe the Chinese numbers, specifically on coronavirus? A favorite narrative of the current White House administration is that we shouldn't. What's your view?
Well, they've just doubled the death rate in Wuhan. Now, you can take two views of that. It was chaos in Wuhan. Social media were full of people distressing stories of trying to, get their relatives into hospitals, being turned away because simply everything was overwhelmed. There will be a fair number of people who died without this being attributed necessarily to the virus at the time. And I bet there will be here too, frankly. There will be people whose deaths have been misattributed. So going back and sort of cleaning up the numbers, I think that's an absolutely okay exercise, and not in itself an admission that there was a cover up in the first place. Lots of things were covered up. The early history of this does not cover the party in glory at all, and we could certainly have been in a very, very different place right now if China had acted, the way Taiwan acted, for example, in the early period. That's not quite the same. I mean, the numbers now, I think, are a less of a sensitive point for China than the origin story, and the battle will continue over the origin story, I'm afraid, for the foreseeable future. And I think the more toxic it becomes, the less our chances of really understanding what the origin really was. If patient zero was in mid-November, what does that mean? You know, that means that the whole wet market story takes on a different role. You know, it may have been the place where it simply exploded rather than the place that it began. But, you know, that's all to discover. And I hope we do. But right now, the atmosphere is not conducive to impartial inquiry, shall we say. Right.
Should we reject out of hand the lab theory?
I would reject nothing out of hand. I mean, that is a lab which has spent years collecting viruses from caves in Yunnan in order to understand the pathogens. It is not impossible that there could have been a mistake, you know. But again, I think the United States is making much of this. 2 years ago, US officials visited that lab and were concerned about standards of security. So maybe but that's not in itself evidence, but it is context. And again, that's something that I think would be very, very difficult now for the Chinese to admit, honestly. And that, you know, that may be part of the obfuscation, but there are many other things that are embarrassing about this whole story for the Chinese government. That one is, I think, pretty hard to admit for anyone. If it's true, I have no idea whether it's true. I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand because there are too many questions around the origin, frankly.
Right.
On Italy, by the way, I just
ahead.
add something, because I thought that was a very good point on Italy. And again, the battle for narrative, which is what we're in now between China and the United States, Italy played quite an important role. Italy was hit very hard and very, very early by the virus. Italy has one of the largest collections of Chinese workers in the textile industry in northern Italy. They come from a city called Whittell, which was not an origin city, but it was the first city outside the province of Hubei to lock down, because there's a very strong connection between Wenzhou and Wuhan. So if you were trying to follow a chain of consequences, it would be quite easy to see that all those workers who were home for New Year in Wenzhou, a city which had just been locked down, and then returned to Italy after the flight ban that Italy has imposed. Again, Chinese social media were full of people giving each other tips on how to get back to Italy by different routes. So we know that happened. And we know that, you know, this was a very fierce outbreak. Equally, the Chinese, because Italy is the only European country that signed up formally to the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese were very, very keen to make Italy a kind of showcase generosity kind of story. And so, and the Italian populist government, it fitted their narrative because the EU has let us down, but China, hooray, China, you know, has come through with masks and equipment and advice and so on. It was only slightly spoiled by the Chinese embassy putting out, or Xinhua news agency putting out a video, which was clearly fake, of lots of Italians singing the Chinese national anthem and shouting "Thank you, Italy" from their balconies. And so it's just very heavy-handed response. But there is a kind of core of a real situation there, which is China trying to exploit, trying to turn the narrative around within Europe about responsibility and you know, who's friend in a crisis. It's a very interesting story.
Right, and of course they have CGTN on hand to report when the doctors and medical supplies arrive in London too.
Yeah.
I just want to give people a chance to talk about anything else that's on their mind while there's still time, if you'd like to. For example, I couldn't help noticing Felicity picking up on a point made, I think, earlier by Zav masquerading as Harika about non-coronavirus hospital admissions and deaths. Are we with Felicity now?
Hi, yes, hi.
What is it that you were discussing last night about people not going into hospital as much as normal?
So the difficulty's been when all the restrictions were put in place. As GPs, we were told we couldn't be seeing anyone. It was just telephone consultations and video consultations. And so there were no referrals either. So I think, and patients obviously took that very seriously. And all of a sudden, yes, we just had nowhere to send patients. Thankfully now, particularly for our children, there's been worries about children with sepsis being missed, cancers being missed, and strokes presenting pathways now. But it just took time. There were so many changes so quickly that initially we had a brick wall of, from patients being able to contact us and then us being able to send them to hospital. So that it has been a huge issue.
But as a GP, are you meeting all your patients virtually?
Yes. Yes.
And how do you make sure that you don't miss cancer or sepsis in those circumstances?
Hard because it's a completely new way of working for us. So there's a big worry. I hope now we're being overcautious in terms of prescribing and referring, but it's a whole new system for all of us, however experienced we are.
And do you have conversations that go like this? I'd like to refer you, but I'm worried that you'll get infected if you go to hospital?
Absolutely. So that's a major problem with lots of not urgent but soon operations that need to be done. You have to weigh up the possibility of infection in hospital, whether it's worth waiting, but then no one really knows how long we're going to be waiting. So it's very challenging.
My goodness, it certainly is. Well, look, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Barney, you've been following chat closer than me. I've left it a little bit late, but are there things that we should have been picking up on that we haven't? I can see that people have been spellbound by Isabel's revelations about China and Italy.
I think this point about unrelated non-coronavirus deaths in the NHS is definitely something worth pursuing, and something worth getting the data on for sure. Zav is saying that cancer ops, his dad has been reporting and saying cancer ops have been cancelled, hospital is emptier than I've ever known it. So obviously something to pick up there, I think, for sure.
Yeah. So that's specifically for us, but we're getting to the end of the hour, and we live slightly in fear of Zoom cutting us off. And this time we have cooked up a play out, which possibly exposes us to intellectual property theft actions, but I'm claiming that we are merely acting as a news organization and putting something out there that was already out there as an intro, and we're going to use it as an outro. All will be explained shortly, but before that, I just wanted to thank very much Sina and Amy for their insights on what it's been like in other parts of Europe with, frankly, more organized governments managing the coronavirus response. Or are they more organized? I learned a great deal about the German response, at least in Berlin, that didn't chime completely with the rather simplistic picture that I'd formed so far from reading about it from a distance. I also think it's really interesting to consider how a very, very much lower death toll in somewhere like Denmark is inevitably going to shape attitudes to government policy and trust in decision making, which seems to be still quite high. And I very much hope that what we've endured here doesn't come to beautiful Denmark. But thank you, really, Isabel, for filling us in on what we should and should not be believing about China, and the connection between particular Chinese cities and the textile industry in northern Italy, I knew nothing about. We haven't had time to get on to discussing what we think is likely to be the near future in the UK. That could be, we could keep that for next week. Lessons to learn from other countries, lessons to impress upon our own government, and much closer to home, the question of how all our own children, or if we are A-level students ourselves, are going to deal with results coming at us in August instead of earlier in the summer as promised. Maybe we can get, we also have a Tuesday think-in next week at lunchtime, and perhaps we could get onto that. But in the meantime, everybody has been at home thinking of crazy new things to do. And we would just like to bring these two things that you will probably have seen already together, just because they're fun and they necessarily synchronize exactly. Now, if at the end of this, when Sam hits play, the screen fades to black and we don't see each other again, thank you very much for coming. But it may not fade to black, in which case we can wave at each other afterwards. But let's just wave at each other now, in case. Thank you, Isabel. Thanks, Jason, Felicity, Barney. Join us again next Friday for Sensemaker Live with Santander. And in the meantime, we'll play you out with this.
That's the forecast. Stay safe, and I'll see you soon.